Okay, so my research focuses on this beetle and how it uses its host plant and what effect that has on its mate choice.
Nice rug it's standing on there.
Thank you. That's a leaf. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background about these beetles. They're called chrysomelids. They're part of the family Chrysomelidae. And they live their entire life on one plant species, usually on an individual plant. They are hatched on that plant from an egg. They live their larval phase on that egg, on that plant, and then they will go to adulthood and finish out their
And
life
you're talking
on
about
the same
individual
plant.
beetles?
Talking about individual beetles will live their whole life on one individual plant.
And then chrysomelids are also known for having the species of beetle live on a species of plant or a series of close relatives.
Right. Most of them are only eat one plant or very few species of plants, usually a couple of closely related species of plants. Some of them eat a bunch, but most of them are pretty selective about what they eat. So what we have found is that when these beetles make a change from one plant to another, and we call the plant they live on their host plant, when they change their host plant, that can make huge changes in the life of the beetle. Spinach to collard greens. If you've lived all your life on spinach and suddenly you start eating collard greens, that's going to make a big change.
And you've had a big change in your socioeconomic status.
Exactly. So you're not hanging out with the beetles who are on the spinach anymore. Now you're hanging out with the beetles that are on the collard greens. So this can lead to differences in a population where they aren't hanging out together anymore. They're eating different food. But they can also lead to differences large enough that we call them ecotypes, in which case they can mate with each other, but they tend not to.
So you're imagining they would each adapt to their new host?
Exactly. Or speciation, where they can't even mate with each other anymore, or they just refuse to. So what I was looking at is this particular beetle, Trirhabda areodictionis, and I apologize, it does not have a common name. It's so little studied and
we
so
could just
little
call
noticed.
it the San Gabriel Mountain chrysomelid beetle
Yes, that's less of a mouthful.
Of Areodictyon.
We could call it that.
All right, Trirhabda.
Okay.
Trirhabda.
Anyway, this lives on two species of Areodictyon that
Yerba Santa.
which we call Yerba Santa, and that's the picture in the background, that live in the San Gabriel Mountains. And so what I was curious about is, do these beetles prefer one of these species of Areodictyon over the other? And if so, what effect does that have on the rest of their life? So here are the two plants, Areodictyon crassifolium and Areodictyon trichocalyx, and since those are
names.
Huge mouthfuls, from now on I'm going to call crassifolium hairy and trichocalyx sticky. And the reason is that you can see in the picture, it looks like the crassifolium leaves are really fuzzy, and they are. They have tons and tons of tiny little hairs all over the leaf, so they look hairy. And the trichocalyx have a really thick resinous layer on them, and they are really, really sticky, to the point that working with them in the lab is actually a huge pain.
And they're called Yerba Santa because they have this sort of nice odor.
They do. They have a really kind of almost menthol odor to them. The labs usually smells pretty nice. So my hypothesis going in was that beetles are going to prefer what I call their natal plant, which is the plant that they hatched on. So if your mother laid eggs at the base of Areodictyon crassifolium, you're going to grow up on that hairy-leaved plant, and you're going to prefer to eat that hairy-leaved plant. And vice versa, if your mom laid the eggs...
Just the opposite of humans.
Just the opposite of humans, where a lot of times we like different things. But I figured with these it makes sense that they would like what they grew up with.
They're beetles, they're dumb.
Well, I don't know if they're dumb or not. I wouldn't insult them like that. The second question I had was, does the plant they live on, their host plant, affect who they choose to mate with? And again, I think they're probably going to prefer to mate with somebody who's on the same plant. So
kind of like humans.
Kind of like humans. We like people who are like us. I figure they're going to like somebody who's living on the same plant, who smells the same, who's been in the same environment. Somebody who's been on the other plant, maybe they have sticky feet, Maybe they smell a little different. They're probably not going to prefer that for a mate.
So it's sort of like your working model behind this is you're sort of you're asking if these things are on their way to speciating.
I would really like to find out if they're on their way to species.
So the group does this kind of speciation, and these beetles are living on two different plants. So it's sort of like you'd think this would be a perfect case.
Exactly.
I get it. Okay.
That's what I'm hoping to find. And there's no research on this beetle, so I have absolutely no idea.
So even though they live like right next to Los Angeles.
Right. It's a 10-minute drive from my house to where these beetles live. There is no research on them at all. And so finally that brings me to the last hypothesis, and that is, are they ecotypes or even possibly cryptic species, which would mean that even though they look exactly the same, they actually don't interbreed. So they're species, we call them cryptic because you can't visually tell them apart. I think they're probably ecotypes. That's what I thought going in. Not species, not cryptic species, but I assumed, given how different these plants are, that there was going to be differentiation in the beetles, and that they're going to really like their home plant.
Educated guess.
Educated guess.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's what I did. To figure out what plant they liked, I did what we call choice feeding tests, which is I gave them a choice. And in this picture, you can see one of the little petri dishes that we used, and there's a larva sitting on one of the leaves. That's that little black thing that looks like a kind of a worm. That's what the larvae look like. And I offered them 2 leaves, one of each plant. And as you can see, the leaves, when we offer them, they don't have any bites in them, so that a couple days later I can look at them, and if they've taken a bite, I can tell that they ate one leaf or the other. With the larvae, I had to wait 2 or 3 days because when they're hatchlings, they're so tiny you can barely see their bite marks. So if I left it for a couple days, I could reliably tell whether they had eaten something. For the adults, I just did it after 1 day. A lot of them didn't eat either thing, and I did not consider those for analysis.
And they eventually died.
They eventually died.
Yes.
Yeah, if you're not going to eat, you're going to die. But when they ate both, I looked at them, and if they obviously ate more than one than the other, then I noted which one they ate more
hairy,
of. Right.
More hairy than
if
sticky.
they ate about the same of both, then I noted that as well. And I actually ended up eliminating those from the analysis as well. And then I did 2-way tables for statistical analysis to determine if there was a difference.
Oh, and there's a 2-way table.
And here's what we get from a 2-way table. So this is the results for the larvae. And these are basically hatchlings or near hatchlings. They're only a few weeks old.
So larvae from hairy versus larvae from sticky.
Yeah, the column on the left is larvae from hairy. The column on the right is larvae from sticky.
And the dotted line?
The dotted line
50%.
shows 50%. And that's what we would expect if they don't have any preference one way or the other. We would expect them to eat half one leaf and half the other.
If they had no taste.
If they didn't care. We know from watching them in the lab that they are really, really mobile. They move around a lot in the little dishes. They definitely move around, and so I was certain that they got the chance to taste or experience both kinds of leaves. So I wasn't worried that if I put them on the hairy leaf, they never saw the sticky leaf. So the 50% shows what we would expect to see if they don't have any preference at all. And the numbers at the bottom of the column, the 22 and the 46, those are the number of beetles that we tested.
So the number of trials.
The number of trials, right.
Okay, so looks like the purple things are above the dotted line, sort of.
So the purple things are above the dotted line. The dark purple is the ones that only ate the hairy leaves. They didn't even try the sticky leaves at all. The light purple are those that tried both, but ate more of the hairy leaves. And for the larvae that came from hairy, they do eat more hairy leaves. But when we did the statistical analysis, we found that this difference isn't really meaningful. We call it, it's not statistically significant.
Well, it's just because you only have 22 of them.
Partly that's only because I have 22 of them.
If you've done 44, maybe?
It might be.
Okay.
It might be. I should have probably done some more, but they grow really fast.
Right. You have to do this all at once.
Yeah. On the larvae that came from the sticky plant, on the other hand, you can see the purple bar is a lot taller. And the statistical analysis showed us that that is a significant preference that they showed for the hairy leaves. So even though these are animals that hatched on the sticky leaves, and their mothers had eaten sticky leaves, they actually preferred to eat the hairy leaves, which I found really surprising. That's not what I would have expected. I expected them to want to eat.
Yeah, it doesn't
what
really
they
go
came
with
from.
your ecotype thing.
It does not go with my ecotype thing at all. So obviously there's something about these leaves
They
that
hate sticky.
they
It's
hate
yucky.
sticky. I hate sticky too. I don't blame them. So now when we did the same test with adults, the adults were completely different. They all preferred eating
where's
the
the
sticky
purple?
leaves. There's no purple. When I offered them, 8 out of 9 ate only the sticky leaves. 1 tried both, but ate way more sticky. So, like, took a bite of the hairy and said, nope, I'm not eating that. I want the sticky.
And these are ones who'd grown up on hairy.
They had grown up on
They
hairy.
presumably had preferred hairy if you had offered them that when they were larvae.
These were raised in the lab from their larvaehood. They had eaten hairy their whole lives. I gave them sticky.
So this is like children not really liking bourbon, and then when they become adults,
suddenly they want to have bourbon. And if you offer them bourbon
and water
they'll take
milk,
they'll take the bourbon every time.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, these are sort of like college students.
Yeah. Well, or professors.
Or college professors, as the case may be. I was surprised at this as well. I figured that adults from the hairy leaves would eat hairy and adults from sticky would eat sticky.
Okay, but you were wrong.
But I was wrong. So one thing I noticed was that when I did this test, I was giving them all new leaves, young, fresh leaves from the sticky plants. And I thought, well, on these sticky plants, you see these new leaves, but you also have the older leaves from the season before, and those are really thick and they're tough. So maybe this preference is only because
going to become old leaves.
They will become old leaves, but right now they're really thin and they're soft. They're super, super sticky, which I thought they wouldn't like, but obviously they do. But I thought maybe it's just because they're soft and tender. Maybe they're just easier to eat. Mm-hmm. So I did a second test with a new batch where I gave them old leaves. So I took from sticky and I took the old leaves from the sticky plants, and this was definitely different. Now when the adults from hairy are offered the older leaves, they say, okay, never mind, I'll take the hairy leaves, thank you very much. Now you can see the light purple bar is huge, so most of them actually tried both, but they did eat more of the hairy. The adults from sticky, they'd still rather have sticky. So, you know, they try, the light green bar shows those that ate both, but ate more of the sticky, and you can see there's a bunch that tried the hairy, but there's definitely a preference for those.
So the stickiness has actually become kind of like an attractant or something.
I think so.
It's not a repellent.
It's not a repellent.
These specialized beetles. Presumably they would be for just grasshoppers or something.
Right. I would think that it would be a repellent and that it would be really hard for them to deal with, but apparently I'm not thinking like a beetle.
Yeah, you're thinking like a grasshopper.
I'm maybe thinking like a human, possibly grasshopper. Okay. So that brings me back to my hypothesis, which was that beetles will prefer their natal plant, and I was wrong. I rejected that hypothesis. The larvae definitely prefer the hairy leaves. The adults prefer the sticky leaves. There are some possible explanations for this. One is that the sticky leaves are just easier to chew. Obviously, the sticky resin is not as much of a barrier or problem that I thought it would be. The other thing is that maybe there's a difference in the strength of the plant's defensive chemicals. So the things that give these leaves their nice smell and that sticky resin, these are things that plants usually develop in order to protect themselves from things that are going to eat them, like these beetles. But a lot of times these defensive chemicals actually turn out to be attractants for beetles like this or for other insects that eat plants. And so
for specialists.
For specialists.
Yeah.
And so these specialists who tend to eat just one or a few plants, they actually become attracted to these defenses instead of being repelled by them. Maybe there's more of a chemical in these fresh leaves. Maybe there's less of a chemical in these fresh leaves. And at this point, I just don't know. So that's an open question that there's more research to be done here. And that's another little larvae on the. So now we can move on. Now we know that there is some preference, not what we expected, but there's definitely a feeding preference. So I decided now let's look at how this affects who they mate with.
Mating trials.
Mating trials. So I did what we call no-choice trials, which is I put one male and one female in a dish together and watched them to see what they did. For the controls, the male...
This is like dating.
This is like dating, except these are, we're setting them up on blind dates and there's no one else in the room.
Right.
So we're not sending them to a restaurant where they can see it, somebody else across a crowded room. We're putting them in a room together.
Yeah.
So for the controls, I have the male and female both coming from the same plant. And then I had another treatment where the male and female came from different plants. So say the male's from Harry, the female's from Sticky. And then I wanted to see...
Across the railroad tracks.
All the way across town. I wanted to see what happens if one of them has switched plants. And I chose the males because the females, when they have a belly full of eggs, their abdomens are absolutely huge. And I think it's going to be very hard for them to fly very far with these gigantic abdomens. So I think it's more likely that if an individual is going to relocate, it's going to be a male. So if there's one who's going to switch from one plant to another, I'm thinking it's probably going to be the male. So what I did was I took males that had started life on one plant, for example, Harry, and either when they pupated into adulthood, or if I had collected them as adults, I then switched them to the other plant. So if they started on Harry, I switched them to Sticky, and then I presented them with a female who was on the Sticky plant, the plant that they had been switched to.
Okay, well let's think about the controls versus the different plants first, and then we'll deal with the switch.
Okay, so so the controls versus the different plants, that's much simpler. So we'll look at those results first. Well, first let me explain a little bit about their mating behavior. First of all, there's almost no courtship that I could tell. The most I could see is that they
the ones on top are the males.
The ones on top are the males. The most I could see is that they would chase each other around the dish a little bit, touch antennae, and then the male would just climb on top of the female and extend that little thing that's coming out of the end of his abdomen. That's called an aedegus. And it's actually it's an intromittent organ. He inserts that into the female, and there is sort of a penis on the end that actually delivers the sperm. If the female accepts the male, then she opens the end of her abdomen, and he inserts his aedegus. He strokes her head with his antennae, and then they are both totally still for usually about 7 to 10 minutes. And then often what happens is the female starts to waggle her body back and forth, shaking really hard. And then after a few minutes of that, then the male withdraws his aedegus and dismounts from the female. And then they're done, and they usually don't have anything to do with each other. They just go to opposite sides of the dish, and they're done. That's the end of their relationship. And I did leave pairs together to see what would happen, and they don't try to mate again. They're done. Now, if the female doesn't accept the male, she curves up the tip of her abdomen. And in this drawing, you can see how her abdomen is curved up, and he actually can't insert his aedegus. So she controls whether he's successful at mating or not. And then she waggles her body back and forth really hard. People who have studied other beetle species in this genus say that the female is trying to dislodge the male. And in other species, apparently the female is able to dislodge the male very quickly. Just a couple of minutes. In this species, I had one pair that went on for 4 hours. So these guys really cannot take a hint.